The studio was dead silent, the kind of silence that wasn't natural, that made people hold their breath without realizing it. A silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier. Anticipation, shock, maybe even fear. The bright studio lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the sleek, modern set. The cameras were still rolling, red lights blinking, capturing every second of the moment that no one in the room had expected. Jacob Wilson sat stiffly in his chair, his once confident posture faltering. He was staring at Karoline Leavitt as if seeing her for the first time, as if he had completely miscalculated what kind of opponent he had invited onto his show. His mouth was slightly open, as if a response was forming but refusing to come out. His hands twitched over the stack of neatly prepared cue cards, the same ones that had given him an edge in every debate, every takedown, every segment where he had effortlessly picked apart his guests. But now, those cards were useless. They couldn't save him. Nothing could. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. Across from him, Karoline sat with a quiet, composed confidence, her expression unreadable. There was no smugness, no gloating, just the steady presence of someone who had been underestimated and knew it. She let the silence stretch, not to be dramatic, not to stall, but because she could. She was in control now, and everyone in that studio, including Jacob himself, felt it. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a lion might watch an injured animal that had wandered too close. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she rested her hands on the glossy table between them, tapping her nails lightly against the surface, the soft, rhythmic sound amplifying the tension in the air. The audience was frozen, their eyes darting between the two figures at the center of it all, waiting, barely even breathing. Jacob swallowed hard. He tried to recover, but the words weren't coming. His show, his domain, the place where he held all the power. It was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. Karoline let him sit in that failure for another long moment before finally breaking the silence. "You really thought you had me, didn't you?" Her voice was calm, not amused, not mocking, not angry. Just steady, unshaken, the way someone speaks when they already know how the rest of the conversation is going to play out. She wasn't asking a question, she was stating a fact. The words hit harder than anything she could have shouted. A quiet, casual dissection of his arrogance, his certainty that he was the one in control. Jacob shifted in his chair, forced a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He reached for the mug in front of him, his fingers curling around the handle, but his grip faltered for just a fraction of a second. A tremor, small but telling. In the audience, someone coughed, a sharp, nervous sound that shattered the unnatural stillness in the room. But it was too late. The shift had already happened. The balance of power had already flipped. The entire segment had been building to this moment, but it wasn't the climax Jacob had planned for. He had spent years dismantling guests, setting traps, guiding conversations exactly where he wanted them to go. He was supposed to be the one pulling the strings. But now, in front of millions, live on air, he was the one unraveling. Karoline didn't look away. She didn't need to. The weight of the moment was already pressing down on him, on everyone watching. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, in the flicker of desperation behind his eyes as he scrambled to find something, anything, to take back control. But there was nothing. She had left him with nothing. And then, black screen, a sharp cut, a beat of silence. But how did it come to this? The show had been advertised as a fair and open discussion. A civil exchange of ideas, a chance to bridge political divides. That was the branding, the illusion, but anyone who had watched Jacob Wilson's program before knew better. It wasn't a discussion, it was a spectacle, a game where he controlled the board, where guests were nothing more than props for him to dismantle, their words twisted, their reputations carefully chipped away in front of a live audience. And tonight the target was Karoline Leavitt. She had known what she was walking into. She had seen the clips, the viral takedowns, where Jacob's smirk widened just as his opponent stumbled. He was good at what he did, and that was what made him dangerous. He didn't yell or pound the table like some of his counterparts. His approach was subtler, more calculated. He wielded sarcasm like a scalpel, cutting deep with a well-timed scoff or a dismissive chuckle. His audience adored it. They tuned in to watch their ideological opponents squirm, and now they were waiting for her turn. The studio was pristine, modern, every surface designed for maximum visual appeal. Bright overhead lights cast a clean, professional glow over the sleek glass table at the center of the stage. The backdrop was a wall of high-definition screens flashing the show's name in bold, confident letters. Rows of audience members sat in tiered seating, their faces barely visible beyond the stage lights. They weren't just spectators. They were part of the performance, trained to react, to applaud at the right moments, to gasp when their host delivered one of his signature gotcha lines. Karoline sat perfectly still, her hands resting loosely on her lap as the pre-show countdown ticked down. She could hear the quiet murmur of producers behind the cameras, the hushed final instructions being relayed through earpieces, the controlled chaos of live television. It was a world she knew well. She had been on the other side before, working behind the scenes, shaping narratives, preparing politicians for moments exactly like this. Now, she was the one in the chair. Jacob was seated across from her, flipping casually through a stack of notes, as if he wasn't reading them but simply letting their presence serve as a reminder that he had done his homework. He was dressed in his usual uniform, tailored dark suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, just unbuttoned enough to project the effortless cool that made him palatable to his audience. His hair was neatly styled, his expression relaxed, confident, like a man who had already won the argument before it had even begun. He glanced up, catching her eye for a brief moment before offering a practiced smile. "Appreciate you being here, Karoline," he said smoothly, leaning back just enough to signal comfort, control. "I know these kinds of conversations can get a little tense." His voice was warm, inviting, the kind of tone that lulled guests into a false sense of security. It was all part of the strategy. Start friendly, set the trap, then tighten the grip. Karoline didn't take the bait. She returned the smile, polite but unreadable. "I think we'll manage," she said simply. A low chuckle rippled through the audience. Not laughter at her expense, not yet, but a quiet acknowledgement that the dance had begun. The producer gave the final countdown. 5, 4, 3. The show's theme music swelled, the stage lights brightened, and the red recording light on the cameras blinked to life. Showtime. Jacob turned to the camera with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, his voice shifting into the polished, engaging cadence that made him one of the most watched hosts on television. Welcome back to the Wilson Report. Tonight we have a special guest, someone who has been making quite a name for herself in conservative media, a former Trump administration press aide, a rising voice in right-wing politics, and someone who has been very vocal about, well, just about everything. Karoline Leavitt, welcome. She nodded, giving the camera a brief but confident glance before turning her attention back to him. "Thanks for having me, Jacob." The exchange was brief, civil, but beneath the surface, the undercurrent of the game was already in motion. The audience didn't come here for pleasantries, they came for the fight, and Jacob knew exactly how to start it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, a hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "So, Karoline, let's start with something simple," he said, flipping to the first page of his notes. "You've made some pretty bold claims about media bias, about what you call the mainstream narrative. I'm curious, do you really believe the media is out to silence conservative voices, or is that just something you say to rally your base?" The audience stirred, sensing the first move. It was subtle, but the message was clear. Frame the question in a way that made her stance seem extreme. Force her to defend herself before the conversation had even truly begun. It was a familiar tactic. Karoline kept her expression neutral, her posture relaxed. She wasn't going to play defense. "I don't think it's about belief, Jacob," she said, her voice measured. I think it's about evidence, and there's plenty of it. Jacob's eyes flickered just for a second. He wasn't expecting her to push back so quickly. He recovered, letting out a soft chuckle as he glanced toward the audience. "Well," he said, flipping his pen between his fingers, "this should be interesting." And just like that, the game had begun. Jacob Wilson adjusted his posture just slightly, leaning forward as he tapped his pen against the table. The audience had settled in, the pleasantries were over, and now it was time to get to the real reason Karoline was sitting across from him. He had done this too many times before to rush it. The key was to start slow, almost casually, to make the guest feel like they were in control before gradually tightening the grip. It was a formula, and it worked. "You mentioned evidence," Jacob said, his tone light but with a deliberate edge. "I'm always interested in evidence. Maybe you can clarify something for us. You've said before that conservative voices are being silenced in the media, that there's a coordinated effort to push certain narratives while burying others. But, Karoline, let's be honest. You're sitting here on one of the biggest news platforms in the country, being broadcast to millions of people. Doesn't that kind of disprove your own point?" The audience responded exactly as expected. A few chuckles, some approving murmurs. It was a classic move. Frame the guest's argument as inherently flawed and let them struggle to justify it. Most guests would immediately go on defense, fumbling to reframe to soften their words. But Karoline didn't hesitate. "As I'm here, it's because your producers think I'll bring ratings, not because they want to amplify my perspective," she said, her tone even. "That's not the same as having an equal voice in the media. If anything, it proves my point. How often do you invite conservative guests on this show, Jacob? And how often do they walk away feeling like they were actually given a fair shot?" Jacob smiled, but it was thinner now, a little tighter around the edges. He lifted a hand, gesturing as if to brush off the question. "Come on, Karoline, we've had plenty of conservatives on this show. Some of them seem to do just fine. Some of them play by your rules," she countered. "They know that if they push too hard, they won't be invited back. You bring them on so you can say you're balanced, but you control the framing, the editing, the narrative. That's not balance. That's optics." Jacob exhaled a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's quite the conspiracy theory, the idea that an entire industry is out to get people who, let's be honest, have some of the most powerful platforms in the country. Fox News, talk radio, right-wing podcasts. You don't think that maybe, just maybe, conservative voices aren't being silenced? That they're just not saying things people want to hear?" The audience chuckled again, a little louder this time. That was a hit. Frame the other side as paranoid, as self-victimizing, make them sound ridiculous, and let the crowd's reaction do the rest. It worked more often than not. But Karoline didn't take the bait. She didn't react, didn't even blink. "Are you saying people don't want to hear me?" she asked smoothly, tilting her head just slightly. "Because your producers seemed pretty eager to book me." For the first time, the audience hesitated. It wasn't a hard hit, not yet, but it was enough to shift the energy just a little. Jacob saw it too, and he didn't like it. His smirk returned, but there was an edge to it now. "Okay," he said, flipping through his notes. "Let's talk specifics. You've made some strong statements in the past about election integrity, about whether or not certain narratives can be trusted. Some would say you've pushed misinformation. Let's go back to something you tweeted a while ago. You wrote, and I quote, "The media will never tell you the truth about what happened in 2020. That's a pretty strong claim. What exactly did you mean by that?" He leaned back, watching her, waiting. This was where most guests started to squirm, where they either softened their stance or tried to deflect. He had pulled up the tweet on the screen behind them, the text bold and undeniable, a pre-packaged gotcha moment. But Karoline remained unfazed. "I meant exactly what I said," she answered. "The media isn't interested in truth, it's interested in control." Jacob let out a small laugh, shaking his head again. "That's a dramatic way to put it." "It's the truth," she replied, her voice just as steady. "Let's not pretend media bias isn't real. We both know certain stories get buried while others get amplified. The question isn't whether bias exists. It's whether people like you are willing to admit it." Jacob's smile barely flickered, but something in his eyes shifted. He was used to guests backing down, scrambling to defend themselves. Instead, she was pushing forward. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. "You know, Karoline, I've been doing this a long time," he said, sitting up straighter. "And every time someone comes on this show claiming they're a victim of the media, it's usually because they said something they just don't want to be held accountable for. So let's get to the real question. What exactly is the media hiding? What's this terrible truth that you think no one wants people to hear?" There it was, the real moment he had been building toward. He was giving her the chance to either backtrack or double down, both of which could be spun against her. He was sure she knew that. He was sure she would hesitate, stumble, try to find a way to phrase it just right. Instead, she smiled. "The truth is that people like you don't want Americans thinking for themselves. You want them thinking what you tell them to think." The audience reacted before Jacob could. A ripple of noise, a sharp shift in the energy of the room. Some murmurs, some scattered applause. Not loud, not overwhelming, but noticeable. Jacob's fingers twitched against his stack of notes. He hadn't expected her to swing back so fast, so cleanly. He had just started the attack, and somehow it already felt like he was the one on the defensive. He couldn't let that happen. He sat up straighter, narrowing his eyes slightly. "That's a great soundbite," he said. "But it's not an answer." And now the real fight would begin. Jacob's smile was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched just a little too tight. He wasn't losing, not yet, but he could feel the balance of control shifting in a way that wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years mastering this format, perfecting the rhythm of a takedown. Draw them in, let them think they're holding their ground, then pull it out from under them at just the right moment. But Karoline wasn't playing by those rules. She wasn't scrambling, wasn't backpedaling, wasn't trying to soften her stance to make herself more palatable. She was meeting every push with an equal and opposite force, and worse, the audience was beginning to feel it. He tapped his fingers against the stack of notes in front of him, flipping through the pages with casual precision, as if he wasn't stalling for time. "All right," he said, forcing an easy chuckle. "Let's put the big, scary mainstream media aside for a second. Let's talk about something more specific. Your position on election integrity. You've repeatedly suggested that we shouldn't take official results at face value, that voters should, quote, question everything. That sounds an awful lot like you're encouraging people to reject democracy when it doesn't work in their favor." There it was. The pivot. He was shifting the conversation, reframing it into something more dangerous. Doubting the media was one thing, questioning elections was another. It was a trap designed to make her look reckless, irresponsible, unhinged. But Karoline didn't flinch. "Questioning isn't rejecting," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "It's called critical thinking. If a government agency tells you something, should you believe it without evidence? If a news outlet with clear political ties presents a story, should you accept it as absolute truth? A free society isn't built on blind trust, it's built on accountability." Jacob let out another short laugh, shaking his head. "Come on, Karoline, this isn't about accountability. It's about undermining institutions because they don't align with your worldview. You and I both know where rhetoric like this leads. The people asking questions you don't want them asking," she shot back. The reaction from the audience wasn't immediate, but it was there. A murmur, a shift, the kind of energy that signaled a conversation slipping out of its planned trajectory. Jacob noticed it too. His smirk faltered just slightly before he forced it back into place. He wasn't about to let her dictate the terms of this exchange. "So what's the line then?" he pressed, leaning forward. "Where does skepticism become dangerous? Because we've seen what happens when bad information spreads. January 6th happened because people believe the things you're defending right now." A sharper reaction this time, a low hum of approval from certain pockets of the audience. He had gone for the kill, tying her directly to something that would instantly discredit her in the eyes of many. It was the kind of connection that would live beyond this interview, the kind of thing that could be clipped and circulated as proof that she was exactly the kind of extremist he had been setting her up to be. He knew it, she knew it, and yet she still didn't blink. The media spent years calling Trump a Russian asset, she said evenly. When that was disproven, did you apologize for pushing a lie? When riots broke out in cities across the country, burning businesses to the ground, did you go on air and say the rhetoric behind them had gone too far? Or is skepticism only dangerous when it comes from the wrong people? A pause. A half-second of dead air that felt heavier than it should have. Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, she kept going. I'm not the one telling people what to think, Jacob. I'm saying they should think for themselves. You, on the other hand, seem really uncomfortable with that idea. The shift in the room was palpable now. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was real. A few scattered claps, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to register. Jacob noticed. His jaw tensed just slightly before he smoothed it over with another manufactured chuckle. Well, he said, exhaling as if she had just proven his point for him. I think we're seeing firsthand how these narratives work. You take legitimate concerns and stretch them until they become something else entirely. Something dangerous. Karoline tilted her head. And who decides when a narrative becomes dangerous? You? That's not what I'm saying. It's exactly what you're saying, she countered. You think people can't be trusted with information unless you're the one filtering it? That's the real conversation here, isn't it? It's not about election integrity or misinformation. It's about control. Another pause. He didn't like this. He was supposed to be leading the conversation, but now he was reacting to it. He had gone in expecting to expose her, to make her look extreme, irresponsible, uninformed. But she wasn't flailing, wasn't reaching. She was standing her ground while he was the one adjusting, recalibrating, trying to keep the balance from shifting completely out of his hands. He needed to regain control, and he needed to do it fast. He exhaled sharply and shook his head. Okay, Karoline, let's take a step back. Wait a minute, she interrupted, her voice still calm, still even. Because the conversation isn't going the way you planned. The audience stirred again, louder this time. It wasn't an eruption, but it was enough. Enough for Jacob to recognize that the energy in the room was no longer fully in his favor. Enough for him to realize that the control he had always relied on, the control that had made his show a weapon against guests like her, was slipping. And Karoline knew it. Jacob could feel it now. The shift. It was subtle but undeniable. The energy in the room, the audience's reactions, the way Karoline held herself as if she wasn't just defending against his questions, but actively dismantling his entire strategy. He had built a career on controlling these moments, on keeping guests on the back foot, making them justify, making them scramble. That was the rhythm. But Karoline wasn't scrambling. She wasn't playing defense. She was pressing forward, and the more she did, the more the foundation of his argument felt like it was cracking beneath him. He needed to regain control, and he needed to do it fast. His fingers curled slightly around his stack of notes as he forced another easy smile, the kind designed to make it look like he was still completely at ease. "All right," he said, exhaling as if this was all amusing, as if she hadn't just exposed his entire approach for what it was. "Let's put aside the media narratives for a moment. Let's talk about your personal record. You've worked under some of the most controversial figures in conservative politics. You've aligned yourself with people who have openly questioned our institutions, our elections, even basic facts. And yet, you position yourself as someone fighting for truth. So, let's be direct. Why should anyone believe you're any different?" It was a pivot, but a calculated one. If he couldn't win on the broader argument, he could make it personal. He could make her the issue, shift the scrutiny onto her credibility, force her into a corner where she either had to defend herself or retreat into vague talking points. Most guests, when faced with this kind of direct attack on their legitimacy, would hesitate, would fumble, would try to reframe. Karoline didn't hesitate. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the space between them, her voice steady but sharper now, the edge of steel finally showing. "You mean, why should people trust me instead of trusting you?" The words landed like a hammer. The audience felt it before Jacob did, a ripple of tension, a murmur, a shift in the weight of the moment. His smile faltered. Not completely, but enough for someone paying close attention to notice. He tried to brush it off with another quiet chuckle, shaking his head like she had just said something ridiculous. "I don't make myself the story, Karoline. That's the difference." "That's exactly the problem, Jacob," she shot back, her voice smooth, unhurried. "You pretend you're not part of the story, but you are. You frame the narratives. You choose what gets covered and what gets ignored. You decide who gets painted as the villain and who gets a pass. And somehow, that's never up for discussion." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. "That's a convenient way to dodge the question." "It's the only question that matters," she countered. "You sit here night after night calling out politicians, pundits, journalists, accusing them of bad faith, of twisting the truth. But who holds you accountable? Who fact-checks you? Who asks you the hard questions?" The audience murmured again, louder this time. Jacob's shoulders squared slightly, his fingers pressing into the table. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one delivering the pressure, not the one feeling it. He could hear the shift in the crowd, some of them leaning in, engaged in a way that wasn't entirely in his favor. He needed to shut this down. "You're deflecting," he said, his voice sharper now, the smile gone. "This isn't about me. This is about your record, your statements, your credibility." "Your credibility isn't on the table?" she asked, arching a brow. "Why not? Because you control the conversation?" Jacob exhaled, shaking his head again, but this time it was different. The air of complete confidence was cracking just slightly. He didn't like this. He didn't like being the one answering instead of asking. His eyes flicked briefly toward the producers behind the cameras, the ones who knew the script, who could see that things weren't going according to plan. There was no obvious way out of this without making it worse. He couldn't cut to commercial without it looking like a retreat. He couldn't dismiss her without risking backlash. He had to turn this around, and he had to do it fast. "All right," he said, leaning in now, his voice lower, as if offering something genuine. "Let's cut through the talking points. Let's be real. You've built a career on criticizing people like me, on calling out media bias, on saying that the American public is being manipulated. So tell me, Karoline, what's your end game? What do you actually want?" She didn't hesitate. She met his gaze directly, her expression unreadable, and then, with perfect clarity, she delivered the words that would define the rest of the segment. "I want people to stop letting you think for them." It was a knockout punch. The kind that didn't need to be shouted, didn't need to be exaggerated. It was simple, clean, devastating. The kind of line that didn't just win arguments, it ended them. The audience felt it, the producers felt it, and Jacob, for the first time in a long time, had no immediate comeback. He could feel the silence stretching, heavy and unavoidable. He had to say something, had to respond, had to reassert control before the entire segment slipped beyond saving. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he saw something shift in the audience. Saw the way some of them were looking at him now, not as the authority in the room, but as the one on trial. And suddenly, for the first time in his career, Jacob Wilson realized that he was losing. Jacob Wilson had built his career on control, controlling the narrative, controlling the conversation, controlling the perception of his guests. But right now, control was slipping through his fingers, and everyone in the room could feel it. The audience was no longer reacting on cue, no longer laughing at his carefully placed jabs, no longer nodding along as he framed the discussion in his favor. Instead, they were watching him, studying him, waiting to see if he could regain his footing, or if this was the moment he finally stumbled. Karoline hadn't just answered his questions. She had turned them into questions of her own, ones he wasn't prepared to answer. He had spent the last 20 minutes trying to make her defend herself, to put her on trial in front of the millions watching at home. But somehow, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, she had flipped the entire dynamic. She wasn't the one on trial anymore. He was. Jacob shifted slightly in his chair, forcing another practiced smile, but it no longer had the effortless charm it carried at the start of the interview. His fingers drummed lightly against the edge of the table, the only visible sign of the frustration creeping into his carefully composed demeanor. He had one last shot to regain control. If he let this moment settle, if he let her have the last word, it would be the moment everyone remembered. He couldn't afford that. "That's a great line," he said finally, forcing a light chuckle, trying to brush past the weight of what had just happened. "Very punchy. I can see why people respond to you, but let's be honest here, Karoline. You talk about independent thought, about not letting the media tell people what to believe, but you're doing the exact same thing. You're just offering a different narrative. So, how are you any different?" It was a last-ditch effort, a final attempt to turn her own argument against her. If he could reframe her as just another partisan figure, another voice playing the same game from the opposite side, he could at least walk away with some dignity intact. He needed her to look defensive, to falter, to prove his point for him. But she didn't give him that. She didn't even hesitate. "The difference," she said, her voice calm, measured, unshaken, "is that I don't expect anyone to take my word for it. I want people to think critically, to ask questions, to challenge everything, including me. You, on the other hand, want them to trust you without question, to accept your framing as fact. That's the difference, Jacob. I don't want control. You do." The silence that followed wasn't just a pause. It was an unraveling. For the first time, Jacob had nothing to say. The comeback wasn't there. The smirk, the knowing glance at the audience, the smooth transition to the next topic. It was all gone. He had walked her into what he thought was a corner, and instead, she had left him standing in an empty space with nowhere to go. Someone in the audience clapped. Just one person at first, then another, and then, all at once, it spread. Not a roaring ovation, not an overwhelming response, but enough. Enough to make it clear that the room had shifted. Enough to make it obvious that, for the first time in a long time, Jacob Wilson was not the one people were agreeing with. His jaw tensed, barely perceptible, but it was there. He forced a chuckle again, but this one was thinner, weaker. He glanced at the producers behind the cameras, the ones who were already calculating how to salvage this in post-production. But it was too late. The moment had happened, and there was no editing it away. "Well," he said finally, clearing his throat, his voice carefully neutral. "I think we've covered a lot tonight. Karoline Leavitt, thank you for being here." She smiled, and this time it was a real one. Not smug, not gloating, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what had happened. "Thanks for having me, Jacob." The cameras were still rolling, the lights still bright, the show still live. But the fight was over. She had won, and he knew it. As the outro music played and the screen faded to black, the only thing left was the silence in the studio, and the realization that this was the interview people would be talking about for a long, long time. The clip spread like wildfire. Within an hour, it was trending across multiple platforms, ripped from the original broadcast and reposted with captions that ranged from triumphant to outright brutal. Jacob Wilson finally meets his match. The moment mainstream media lost control, Karoline Leavitt just ended his career on live TV. The engagement was immediate, relentless. Twitter exploded with reaction threads, Instagram was flooded with reels dissecting every second of the exchange, and YouTube compilations of top 5 times media lost control now had a new #1 spot. The impact was impossible to ignore. On Wilson's official page, the comments were a disaster. Thousands of people flooding his latest posts, demanding a response, accusing him of being exposed, of being exactly what Karoline had called him out for. His loyal followers tried to spin it, calling her disrespectful, claiming she hadn't answered his questions. But the overwhelming consensus was clear: he had been outmaneuvered, and worse, he had been made to look weak. Meanwhile, Karoline didn't need to say a word. She didn't do an immediate victory lap, didn't post a reaction video, didn't issue any statements. She simply let the moment breathe, and that silence made it even more powerful. Others did the work for her. Conservative influencers hailed it as a defining moment, a masterclass in composure under pressure. Even some neutral commentators admitted that she had flipped the interview in a way rarely seen. The viral clips weren't just coming from her supporters, they were coming from people who had never paid attention to her before. Major media outlets scrambled to control the narrative. Some dismissed it as a heated exchange. Others avoided mentioning it entirely, hoping it would die down, but it didn't. The algorithms wouldn't let it. Reaction videos kept racking up millions of views. Memes flooded every corner of the internet. One still frame in particular, a shot of Jacob Wilson mid-sentence, looking completely at a loss while Karoline sat back calmly, became an instant classic. The caption, "Processing, please wait." By the next morning, the numbers were undeniable. Karoline's follower count had skyrocketed. Her name was in every major headline, whether people loved her or hated her. Jacob's team quietly pulled clips of the interview from their own social channels, trying to suppress the damage, but it was too late. The internet had already decided. This wasn't just another interview, this was a moment, and no amount of spin could change that.